Okay, so today's question that I am pondering and exploring with you is how the fuck are we meant to live cyclically and in alignment with our menstrual cycle in a world that does not recognise our cyclical nature? And this, I guess, is all about really just acknowledging that, like, in an ideal world, we'd all learn menstrual cycle awareness and we'd practice MCA, menstrual cycle awareness, and be able to live fully in sync with our menstrual cycle. But most of our realities isn't that. And that's through no fault of our own. That is because ultimately we do live in a linear society. We live in a society that expects the same productivity every single day. It doesn't allow for that ebb and flow of energy, of mood, of all the different, I guess, facets of who we are within the context of our cycle. And this is a conversation that I have had with a lot of people when they're first introduced to the concept of menstrual cycle awareness. And, you know, we talk a lot about the different tasks in each season of the cycle, you know, like resting when you're in your winter and speaking your truth in autumn and socializing in summer and the ovulation and all of that kind of thing. But the biggest resistance is usually around menstruation, because I think in our society kind of allows for that in a spring and in a summer, but not so, it isn't so accommodating for that in a autumn and in a winter aspect. So a lot of people, when they're first introduced to this idea of the kind of tasks of each phase, particularly winter and autumn, but especially winter, they say, well, that's just not realistic for me. Like, I can't just drop everything. I can't rest on my bleed. And so I guess this conversation and this episode, this post is all about kind of exploring that and what can we do, because I think it's really important to acknowledge the reality of most of our lives, and that, you know, we can't just walk off into the woods and free bleed for 5 days every month. Like, that is not the reality. So, and I think it's also really important to acknowledge that as much as we might try, even if we have the capacity to align our cycle with, you know, I'm in a very fortunate position where I'm in a position where often I can take quite a lot of rest on my bleed, but that doesn't mean that life doesn't get in the way. You know, we can't control everything in life. Sometimes our period is late because we've ovulated late because of stress, so then that throws our plans off, even though we've planned to have this big bleed and this rest during our winter. You know, work schedules are often outside of our control, and like life emergencies get in the way. And so even if we can live in alignment with our menstrual cycle, and we do have that freedom, and if you are one of those people that has the freedom to do that, I think you'll find this episode really valuable anyway, because these principles can apply. And I'm going to give you 2 practical principles to apply in a situation where you can't quite live fully cyclically as you might want to. And I think that this is really helpful even for those people who can live relatively cyclically, because, you know, there are going to be times where things don't quite go as planned. And yeah, I really want to recognise that kind of patriarchal capitalism kind of thing where it's all about consistent productivity, and that it is not always, you know, like at work saying, yeah, sorry, I have to rest for 3 to 5 days of my bleed every month. Like, that's not always going to be met with a positive understanding, like, oh my gosh, yes, of course, your bleed is so sacred. It's just not the reality that most of us live in. And I think there's a tension to address between that real desire to want to live cyclically, because I think most people, when they discover this practice, they're like, oh my god, yes, this is what I need. And then also almost processing the grief, I guess, of the societal expectations that are around us. And this is what my work is all about, right? Is like actually not just seeing it in like your individual context, but seeing your experience in this wider context of like, there's a lot of grief around the societal expectations placed on women and people who menstruate to kind of go against their nature, and also women in general, just for a whole bunch of other reasons. So yeah, I'm hoping that with these two tips that I'm going to go over, or these two kind of mindset shifts, or whatever you want to call them, that it can kind of, I don't know, ease that tension between that desire to want to live cyclically and then the reality of our everyday lives. And hopefully give you something practical to do, you know, even if you do live totally cyclically, but then in those moments where life gets in the way and you end up having, you know, a work meeting when you're on your bleed. You know, I speak to so many people who do their first big bleed, which is where you really give yourself, you know, you take time off work, like really give yourself the space to experience your inner winter, and they'll schedule all this time off and stuff, and it's so beautiful, and then their period's late. You know, they ovulate late, and then that means that their period's delayed. And so it's kind of like, yeah, I guess these are really beautiful practices for in those moments where things just don't quite go to plan. So the first one is 1% shifts. So often when people start this practice of menstrual cycle awareness, myself included, there can be this kind of pressure to do it right and like change everything overnight and go from not really even having an awareness of your menstrual cycle, or in my case being on the pill, to being able to have this like magical experience of your bleed and like hyper energy and ovulation, and just like if your experience isn't matching up to that, you're like, oh god, like I must be doing something wrong. And I definitely had this with, well, to be honest, like my whole cycle. When I first came off the pill, there were a lot of shoulds and a lot of this is how it should look like. And I need to, in order to be able to experience the wisdom and magic that everybody keeps talking about of my cycle, I need to 100% rest on my bleed. And I need to, like, it's like I had it in my head that I had to earn it, that it was a privilege that I had to earn. And the danger of this like all or nothing mentality is just that it becomes like another source of pressure and another way that we can just tell ourselves that we're not doing good enough, that we're not doing it right, that we aren't enough, that, you know, we're failing. It's just like another way that we can beat ourselves up. So I think this 1% shifts rule, which I will explain fully what it is in a second, but is really, really important for like removing that all or nothing thinking and that perfectionism. Because if there's one thing that I have really learned through my menstrual cycle awareness practice, is that your menstrual cycle does not demand perfection. Your menstrual cycle does not demand perfection at all. Your menstrual cycle isn't keeping tabs on like, have you rested enough on your bleed? Have you just achieved just the right amount? And are you honouring your spring in just the right way? Like, your menstrual cycle doesn't really give a shit about that. What is really important is the intention to connect in with where you are at and your experience of the cycle. And it's about the intention in that. It's not about doing the right kind of ritual, doing the right kind of meditation for the right day of your cycle, eating the right seeds for your cycle, eating, you know, exercising right, and like all of this stuff, right? That can just be ways for us to beat ourselves up more. It's not about that at all. And so the 1% shifts can really help take us out of this like self-imposed pressure of having to radically change our life overnight, but also addresses that tension of like that desire, because that desire might be there. It's like, yeah, oh my God, I want to overhaul my entire lifestyle completely live cyclically, and if you run a business or you're freelance or whatever, you know, I want to like cycle sync all of my content. So for example, for me, like I have done this in my business in the past where I'm like, I have to make all of my Instagram content and all of my podcasts and in that 1 week when I'm ovulating. And it's so stressful and it's not realistic. And if that works for you, then that's great. That's awesome. Keep doing it. This is all about finding what works for you, but it can become that stressful thing. And I think that this 1% shift and making these small shifts can address that tension between what you desire to do versus what is realistic for you to do. So essentially the 1% shift is thinking about what you would really love to give yourself, like what it would be if you could just wave a magic wand, like what would you just love to do on that day of your cycle or for that in a season or whatever, and then find a way to give yourself 1% of that. Just 1%. So I always use I use the example of in a winter because I think it just so beautifully demonstrates it. So like you might really wish you could just like take the time off work, leave the kids. I don't have kids, just to put a disclaimer there, but I imagine, you know, I know from a lot of my friends who practice menstrual cycle awareness and clients that is a huge factor, right? You know, you might want to just ditch everything and just be left to bleed in peace. And of course, and that is so valid. And that might not be a reality. So how can you give yourself 1% of that? Is it 5 minutes just sat and just breathing? Is it, you know, I don't even know, it could even be, you know, 2 minutes whilst you go to the toilet, leave your phone and just like check in, just go, take a deep breath, you know, that kind of thing. And over time, these 1% changes create your new normal. So how I spend my bleed now compared to how I spend my bleed now felt so unrealistic when I first started practicing menstrual cycle awareness because of the external stuff, but also like within myself, like my own guilt around resting. And that's probably a topic for a whole other episode. But yeah, all these like internal constraints that I put on myself. And so it felt really unsafe to fully drop into the rest that I now drop into around my bleed. And that happened through these small shifts. Each bleed, you know, each cycle, I'm going, okay, how can I honour this just 1% more? How can I honour myself 1% more? And oh my God, that is like such a radical act. So many people don't even do that. Right? So many people, especially if you've been socialised as a woman, we are socialised so much to be over-givers and people pleasers and just give and prioritise everybody else to just even 1%, take a 1% shift, one little baby step in the direction of putting you as number one is so powerful. And I really don't want you to underestimate the power of these really small shifts that might seem insignificant. They're really, really not. They're really not. Like this is huge work, not just on, you know, an individual level, but on this like wider level of undoing all of that like conditioning and misogyny and all of that. And then also those 1% shifts, if you check in 1% more every single day, or even if you just go, right, I'm going to check in, I'm just going to lean into my cycle 1% more every day for the next month. That adds up over the cycle. So this is all about building a relationship with your menstrual cycle so that there's that, you know, that free-flowing kind of communication, and it's this tool to really understanding yourself and what you need and going on this kind of self-development journey, I guess. And that strengthening comes from that consistent practice. It doesn't come from like, you know, one big gesture. I guess like look at it in relationships, right? Like one big gesture is beautiful, great, lovely. But actually what builds a strong, steady relationship is lots of little moments of connection over time. And so thinking about your menstrual cycle in that way is really, really powerful. Now, of course, there are times where even 1% can feel impossible. And this is where I want to introduce you to the idea that if you cannot change what you are doing, change how you are doing it. So sometimes, life responsibilities don't always align with our cycle. Sometimes, spanner gets thrown in the works, and, sometimes we can't avoid having to work or having to attend events and, that kind of thing when we're in a phase where we would rather not. And when this happens, how we do things is just as important as what we're doing. So approaching tasks, again, so I'll use the example of in a winter because this is generally the phase that society kind of doesn't allow for as much. When we're in that phase, like approaching it with the energy of menstruation, right? Like bringing a different kind of a slower, more gentle, more intentional, present energy to what you're doing can make a huge difference. So a really great example of this is if you have to go to work or have a social event. So for me, I've had to go to social events when I've been menstruating, and I, have gone and said to myself, no, it's okay. I'm bleeding right now. I'm going to go. I'm going to be intentional about how I show up, and I'm going to allow myself to maybe not show up as the bubbly, sparkly Claire that everybody sees when I'm ovulating. To not have to meet those standards that generally are also quite self-imposed, or certainly for my case, I think I have this idea that if I don't show up as this 100%, that people will be really disappointed, or what will they think of me? And this is a huge part of what stops us doing this, right? And that's why this is another way that you really can honour your menstrual cycle, is showing up in the energy that you are in. You're showing up in that inner winter energy, showing up in that inner spring energy, however you want to show up, and whatever is feeling genuine to you from that menstrual cycle check-in that you do in the morning. Showing up that way is just as much of a powerful way to honour your menstrual cycle than kind of shuffling things around or changing your life or shifting things out. And another good example is okay, you rush out the door, you're drinking your coffee, trying to get to work, trying to find your shoes, and where the fuck did you put your car keys? And it's all super hectic. But maybe when you're on your bleed, you intentionally choose to go, no, I'm actually gonna choose to move a little bit slower. I'm gonna just maybe not physically move slower, but energetically, if that makes sense. You can still be doing the things, but just taking a breath, doing it from that leaning back kind of state rather than leaning forward and going, I need to sort all this out. And then the other thing that I also would recommend, and it feels really edgy for a lot of people, but I think it's so fucking needed, is being open about the fact that you are on your period. If people go, are you okay today? You seem kind of down. I'm yeah, I'm on my bleed. So I'm just taking things, a little bit slower, and I'm feeling okay. Yeah. Or if you're not feeling okay, saying that. No, I'm on my period. I'm in quite a lot of pain. I don't really want to be here right now. Obviously within reason, you can't tell I don't know if you have a business meeting with clients, you can't exactly go, yeah, I don't really want to be here right now. But you know what I mean? You can find that middle ground. And I think this feels so edgy for so many of us, and has felt so edgy for me for such a long time. And in certain circumstances, it still feels edgy for me, because we know that people might not get that. The majority of people, because of the way we are viewing the menstrual cycle in society, and that it's this hush hidden, you can't speak about that. We feel we're going against that societal norm by speaking out about it and saying, yeah, I'm bleeding. And and then there's all this shit about it being dirty and and we can feel we mustn't let anybody know that we're bleeding, because then they'll judge me and think I'm gross or whatever. There's all this stuff that is part of undoing that patriarchal conditioning around it. But it is so needed. It's so needed, and it's so powerful. And 9 times out of 10, I don't actually think I've ever had a negative experience so far when I have told someone that yeah, actually, I'm on my period. Like, sometimes people are a bit, like, taken aback. Like, I don't know if you've seen that video where Katy Perry says, like, yeah, I just did all that on the first day of my period. And Taylor Swift's like, oh, okay. Like, and she makes a bit of a face about it. And, like, that's probably the worst that people have, like, haven't even been that bad, but, like, just being a bit surprised or a bit uncomfortable. But also, like, that is their discomfort to hold. Like, you do not have to make people comfortable when you are simply sharing where you are at and what is happening and a simple biological process that is happening in your body right now. It's bullshit that we have to hide that. So those are the kind of the two ways that we can honour our cycle whilst living in a linear, patriarchal, capitalistic society that does not honour our menstrual cycle at all. So those are two ways that they're really beautiful places to start. And I guess I also want to say, like, menstrual cycle awareness is a practice. It's called menstrual cycle, like practicing menstrual cycle awareness, because it isn't about perfection. It's about figuring out what works for you and your life. And again, like I said, like, honouring that tension between, like, you might desire something but not actually in reality be able to do it, and honouring the grief that is there and the frustration that is there, and trusting that there's, you know, there's something in that as well to be gleaned. And you really don't need to be living this perfect cycle-focused, totally cycle-aligned life for MCA, menstrual cycle awareness, to, like, work its magic. You really, really don't. You really don't have to be 100%, like, giving that 100% with it for it to really work. And it works. It's like so magical and powerful for all kinds of people, whether you're, like, this single mum that is just, like, totally overwhelmed and just, like, this is so chaotic, or you're living, like, a more simple life where you do have more spaciousness to live in sync with your cycle. And I think it's really important that this practice is accessible for everyone, so that we can start as a wider group and as a society to shift those narratives, so that it then does become easier to have a menstrual cycle and honour that in those more, like, physical, practical ways. And the last thing I want to leave you with is an invitation to push the edges of what feels comfortable when asking for that 1%. Often when we ask for that 1%, we feel like, oh, I can't ask that, or we have to do it alone, and not being vocal about it. And again, there's so much conditioning behind that. It's not that you are broken or wrong or anything like that, but actually asking for that time off, asking for help from your partner or your friends or your support system. It's okay to prioritize that and be vocal about it, even if it feels a bit uncomfortable for you. Like, there's a narrative that you're telling yourself that it's uncomfortable and that it is unfair. And even if other people might see it that way, it's okay to prioritize yourself. And I really think that by demanding more for yourself, you really do contribute to changing how society sees the menstrual cycle, and also women's bodies, and just women and people who menstruate in general. And just, you know, it has to start with us. There has to be, you know, tend your own garden, that's the saying, right? And that can be just as powerful as going out and doing all this advocacy work and that kind of thing. Okay, thank you so much for your time and listening to this. I massively appreciate it, and I would love to hear how this lands for you, if you've had any aha moments, if there's anything that feels super uncomfortable. You can reach out to me on Instagram or by email or on Substack as well.